Welcome to this exciting video, about chapter 19, of Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. In this chapter, Machiavelli explores the theme of how a prince can avoid being hated and despised by his subjects. He argues that this can be achieved by avoiding being considered rapacious, usurping, fickle, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, and indecisive. Instead, the prince must reflect greatness, animosity, gravity, and strength through his actions, and ensure that his judgment is irrevocable. This chapter is full of valuable advice for every ruler. So, get ready to immerse yourself in this captivating read. To allow the greatest possible number of readers to access the content, this video is also available in the following languages: English, Spanish, Italian, French, and Portuguese. But, since I have already spoken about the most important qualities mentioned earlier, I want to briefly discuss the others, under these generalities, so that the prince may think, as already partly mentioned, to avoid those things that make him hateful and contemptible. And every time he avoids this, he will have done his duty, and will not encounter any danger of infamy in other matters. He is made hateful above all, as already said, by the fact of being rapacious, and a usurper of the property, and women of his subjects, of which he must abstain. And every time he does not take away, either the property, or the honor of all men, they live satisfied. And, the only obstacle, is the ambition of a few, which can be easily restrained, in many ways. He is made contemptible, by being considered variable, light, effeminate, pusillanimous, indecisive. A prince must avoid this, like a rock, and must ensure that his actions reflect greatness, animosity, gravity, and strength. And as for the private dealings of his subjects, he must make sure that his judgment is irrevocable, and maintain the opinion that no one thinks of deceiving or manipulating him. The prince who enjoys such a reputation is highly respected and difficult to conspire against. It is difficult to attack him, as long as he is considered excellent and respected by his subjects. In fact, a prince must have two fears: one internal, regarding his subjects, and the other external, regarding powerful foreigners. He defends himself from the latter with good weapons and good friends. If he has good weapons, he will also have good friends. Internal matters will remain stable when external ones are, unless they are disturbed by a conspiracy. And, even if external matters were to move, if the prince has been ordered, and has lived as I have described, and never abandons himself, then, he will be able to resist every attack, just as the Spartan Nabid did. But as for the subjects, when external things are quiet, one must fear that they may conspire in secret. The prince must protect himself from this by avoiding being hated or despised, and keeping the people satisfied with him, which is necessary, as has been widely discussed before. One of the most effective remedies a prince has against conspiracies is not to be universally hated. Because whoever conspires believes that, with the death of the prince, the people will be satisfied. However, if he thinks to offend the prince, he will not have the courage to undertake such an enterprise, since the difficulties he will encounter will be infinite. Moreover, from experience, it is known that there have been many conspiracies, but few have been successful, because whoever conspires cannot act alone, nor can he recruit companions, except among those he believes to be dissatisfied. And, immediately after revealing his intent to a dissatisfied person, he gives him the opportunity to be satisfied, because he can clearly hope for every advantage. Therefore, seeing the certain gain on one side, and the uncertain, and full of dangers, on the other, it will be a rare friend, or a stubborn enemy, of the prince, to observe his loyalty. To summarize the matter, I can say that on the side of the conspirators, there is only fear, jealousy, and the concern for the punishment that frightens them. On the other hand, the prince can rely on the majesty of his power, on the laws, on the protection of friends, and the state that defend him. Moreover, if one adds to all this the benevolence of the people, it is impossible for anyone to be so daring as to organize a conspiracy. In fact, usually, if a conspirator is afraid before carrying out his evil plan, in this case, he should fear even more after the execution of the plan, since he will have the people as an enemy and cannot hope for any kind of refuge. Of this topic, infinite examples could be given, but I will settle for one, which concerns the memory of our fathers. Messer Annibale Bentivoglio, grandfather of the current Messer Annibale, who was the Prince of Bologna, was assassinated by the Conisci, who had conspired against him, and no one remained except Messer Giovanni, who was still a child. Immediately after the murder, the people rose up and killed all the Conisci. This happened because of the popular affection that the Bentivoglio family had among the people of Bologna. It was so strong that, with no one in Bologna, from the Bentivoglio family, capable of governing the state, after Annibale's death, the Bolognese went to look for a Bentivoglio, born in Florence, and who until then, had lived as the son of a blacksmith. They brought him to Bologna, and appointed him governor of the city, which was governed by him, until Messer Giovanni was old enough to take control. Therefore, I conclude that a prince should consider conspiracies of little account when the people are favorable to him, but when they are hostile and hate him, he should fear everything and everyone. Well-ordered states and wise princes have always sought with great care not to disperse the great, to satisfy the people, and to keep them content, since this is one of the most important issues for a prince. The best ordered and governed kingdom of our times is that of France, where there are countless good constitutions that guarantee the freedom and security of the king. The first of these constitutions is the parliament, and its authority, because those who have governed that kingdom, recognizing the ambition of the powerful, and their insolent arrogance, have deemed it necessary to put a check on them. On the other hand, knowing that the great were hated by the majority, and basing their power on fear, they wanted to secure support of both the people and the great, without making the king the sole guarantor of their rights. Therefore, they constituted a third judge, who, without being subject to pressure from the king, would judge the great and protect the weaker ones. There is no better order, nor more prudent, nor greater guarantee for the safety of the king and the kingdom. From this, another important lesson can be drawn. Princes must entrust matters of burden to others, and matters of grace to themselves. Finally, I conclude that a prince must respect the great, but not make himself hated by the people. To many, considering the lives and deaths of some Roman emperors, it might seem that there are counterexamples to my opinion, namely, that some have always lived in an outstanding way and demonstrated great virtue, but have still lost the empire or been killed by their own, who plotted against them. Therefore, in order to respond to these objections, I will discuss the qualities of some emperors, showing the causes of their downfall, not dissimilar from those I have exposed, and in part, I will take into account those things that are relevant to those who read the actions of those times. It will suffice for me to consider all the emperors who succeeded in the empire of Marcus, the philosopher, up to Maximinus, namely Marcus, his son Commodus, Pertinax, Julian, Severus, Antoninus, his son Caracalla, Macrinus, Elagabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. First of all, it's important to note that, while in other principalities one only had to deal with the ambition of the great and the insolence of the people, Roman emperors had to face a third difficulty: enduring the cruelty and greed of the soldiers. This was so difficult that it often led to the ruin of many, as it was hard to satisfy both the soldiers and the people. The people loved peace, and therefore loved modest princes, while the soldiers loved a prince with a military spirit, who was insolent, cruel, and greedy. These things required the prince to exercise them on the people, in order to have a double salary, and to vent their greed and cruelty. These are the things that caused those emperors, who, by nature, or by ability, did not have a great reputation, to always collapse. Most of them, especially those who came to power as new men, aware of the difficulty of reconciling these two different moods, sought to satisfy the soldiers, not caring too much about offending the people. This choice was necessary because, since princes cannot avoid being hated by someone, they must first strive not to be hated by the entire community. And when they cannot achieve this, they must try by all means to avoid the hatred of the more powerful communities. That is why those emperors who needed extraordinary favors, due to their novelty, preferred to adhere to the soldiers rather than to the people, which, however, was useful to them or not. depending on how well the prince managed to maintain his reputation with them. From the aforementioned causes, it happened that Marco, Pertinax, and Alexander, all being of modest life, lovers of justice, enemies of cruelty, humane, and kind, had all, except Marco, a sad fate. Marco alone lived, and died very honored, because he succeeded to the empire by inheritance, and he did not have to recognize it to either the soldiers or the people. Furthermore, accompanied by many virtues that made him venerable, he always maintained his order and his dominion, without ever being either hated or despised while he lived. But Pertinax, created emperor against the will of the soldiers, who were accustomed to living licentiously under Commodus, and could not bear the honest lifestyle that Pertinax wanted to bring them back to, provoked hatred, and, adding to it the contempt for his old age, ruined himself at the beginning of his reign. And here it must be noted that hatred is acquired through both good and bad actions. So, as I said before, if a prince wants to maintain his state, he is often forced to not be good. In fact, when the university, the people, the soldiers, or the nobles that you need to maintain your power are corrupt, you have to follow their mood to satisfy them, and your good actions become enemies. But let's talk about Alexander. He was so good that, among the other praises attributed to him, there is this: during the 14 years he held the empire, no one was ever unjustly killed by him. However, being considered effeminate, and a man who let himself be ruled by his mother, he fell into contempt, and the army conspired against him and killed him. Speaking now, on the contrary, about the qualities of Commodus, Severus, Antoninus Caracalla, and Maximinus, you will find them to be extremely cruel and rapacious. These rulers, in order to appease their soldiers, did not spare any form of abuse that could be committed against the population. All of them, except for Severus, met a sad fate. Indeed, Severus had such virtue that, by keeping the soldiers as friends, he could still reign happily, even if the population was burdened by his decisions, because these virtues made him so admired by both the soldiers and the population that they were somewhat stunned and amazed, while others respected him and considered themselves satisfied. And, since the actions of this man were grand and remarkable in a new prince, I want to briefly show how well he knew how to use the strength and ferocity that I said earlier were necessary for a prince to imitate. Knowing the cowardice of Emperor Julian, Severus persuaded his army, of which he was the captain, in Illyricum, to go to Rome, to avenge the death of Pertinax, who was killed by the Praetorian soldiers. Under this guise, without showing any aspiration for the empire, he led his army against Rome, and was already in Italy before his departure was known. Upon arriving in Rome, the Senate, out of fear, elected him emperor, and executed Julian. After this, Severus faced two difficulties in wanting to subjugate the entire state. One in Asia, where Pescennius Niger, commander of the Asian armies, had declared himself emperor, and the other in the west, where Albinus, who also aspired to the empire, was located. Considering it dangerous to make enemies of both, he decided to attack Niger and deceive Albinus. He wrote to the latter that, having been elected emperor by the Senate, he wanted to share that dignity with him, and sent him the title of Caesar, and the Senate appointed him as his colleague. Albinus accepted all of this as true. But, once Severus had defeated and killed Niger, and pacified the East, he returned to Rome, and complained to the Senate that Albinus, ungrateful for the benefits received from him, had attempted to kill him. Therefore, it was necessary for Severus to go and punish his ingratitude. Later, he went to find him in France, and took away his state and his life. Whoever examines this man's actions carefully will find him to be a most ferocious lion and a most cunning fox. He will see him feared and respected by all, and not hated by the armies. It is not surprising that, being a new man, he was able to maintain such an empire, since his great reputation always defended him from the hatred that the people might have for his plundering. But his son Antoninus, in turn, had excellent qualities that made him wonderful in the eyes of the people, and pleasing to the soldiers. He was a military man, resistant to every hardship, despised every delicacy of food, and every other comfort. This made him loved by all the armies. However, his ferocity and cruelty were such, and so unheard of, that, after many individual killings, he had caused a large part of the population of Rome, and all of Alexandria, to be killed. Thus, he became hateful to the whole world, and began to be feared, even by those who were close to him. So much so, that he was killed by a centurion in the midst of his army. It is important to note that similar deaths, which occur due to the decision of a stubborn mind, are reserved only for inevitable princes, because anyone who does not care about their own life can take offense. However, the prince should be less concerned, as they are very rare. They should only be careful not to commit serious injuries against those who serve and surround them in their government, as Antoninus did, who contemptuously killed a brother of that centurion and threatened him every day. However, he kept him as his bodyguard, which was a reckless behavior, and led to his downfall, as happened to him. But let's talk about Commodus, who had an easy time maintaining the empire, since he had a hereditary right, as the son of Marcus. All he had to do was follow in his father's footsteps, to satisfy both the people and the soldiers. However, being cruel and bestial in nature, he turned to entertaining the armies and making them licentious, in order to use his rapacity on the people. On the other hand, not maintaining his dignity, he often descended into theatres to fight with gladiators, and did other vile things unworthy of the imperial majesty, becoming an object of contempt for the soldiers. And, since he was hated by some and despised by others, he was conspired against and killed. We have yet to narrate the qualities of Massimino. He was a very warlike man, and, since the armies were tired of the softness of Alexander, whom I have already mentioned, they elected him emperor upon his death. However, he did not reign for long, due to two things that made him hated and despised. The first was his low social class, as he had been a shepherd in Thrace, something that was well known everywhere, and made him despised by everyone. The second was because, having delayed his entry into Rome and the assumption of imperial power, he gave the impression of being cruel, with his prefects committing many cruelties in Rome and anywhere else in the empire. Thus, the whole world was unleashed by indignation for the baseness of his lineage, and by hatred for the fear of his ferocity. First, Africa revolted. Then, the Senate, with all the people of Rome. And, finally, all of Italy united against him. Added to all this was his own army, which camped at Aquileia, and finding it difficult to take, tired of his cruelty, and fearing the many enemies, killed him. I have no intention of discussing either Elagabalus, Macrinus, or Julian, who, being entirely focused on the army, quickly extinguish. I will come to the conclusion of this discourse. I say that the rulers of our time have less difficulty in satisfying their soldiers, extraordinarily, in their governments, since, even though they must take them into consideration, they resolve quickly, so as not to have armies entrenched with the government and administration of the provinces, as happened with the armies of the Roman Empire. Therefore, if in the past it was necessary to satisfy the soldiers more than the people, it was because the soldiers had more power than the peoples. Now, however, all rulers, except the Turk and the Sultan, must satisfy the people more than the soldiers, because the people have more power than them. Except for the Turks, who always have around themselves 12,000 foot soldiers and 15,000 horsemen, on which the security and strength of their kingdom depends. All other princes must maintain the friendship of soldiers, without paying attention to anything else. For example, the Sultan's kingdom is entirely in the hands of soldiers, and therefore, he must also maintain their friendship, without paying attention to the will of the people. It should be noted that the state of the Sultan is different from all other principalities, because it is similar to the Christian pontificate, which cannot be called either hereditary principality or new principality, because the sons of the senior prince do not inherit power, but whoever is elected to that position by those who have the authority. And, since this order is ancient, it cannot be called a new principality, because there are no typical difficulties of new principalities, because, even if the prince is new, the orders of the state are ancient and predisposed to welcome him, as if he were their hereditary lord. But returning to our subject, I say that, whoever considers the previous discourse, will see that hatred, or contempt, were the cause of the ruin of those mentioned emperors, and will also understand where the fact came from, that, since some of them proceeded in one way, and others in the opposite way, only one of them had a happy ending, while the others did not. In fact, for Pertinax and Alexander, who were new princes, it was useless and harmful to try to imitate Marcus, who was in power by hereditary succession. And similarly, it was dangerous for Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximinus to try to imitate Severus, as they did not have the sufficient virtue to follow in his footsteps. Therefore, a new prince in a new principality cannot imitate the actions of Marcus, nor is it necessary to follow those of Severus, but he must take from Severus those parts that are necessary to establish his state, and from Marcus those that are appropriate and glorious to preserve a state that is already established and secure. In conclusion, Chapter 19 of Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince offers many interesting reflections on the qualities that a prince should possess in order to be respected and feared by his subjects. Machiavelli emphasizes the importance of avoiding behaviors that could make him hateful or contemptible in the eyes of the people, such as being a usurper or ambiguous. Instead, a prince should show greatness, animosity, gravity, and strength, maintaining the belief that no one can deceive or manipulate him. This chapter remains a source of discussion and reflection, even today, inviting us to question the qualities of a good leader and the nature of power. This video is available in English, Spanish, Italian, French, and Portuguese.